The air inside the mansion that morning was too still, as if it already knew what was coming. Outside, the oak branches groaned against a low, humid sky, the kind that pressed down on your lungs and made every breath feel like guilt. Beneath that roof, a roof he built with his own hands, Moses stood alone, holding a hammer slick with sweat, his heart pounding like a drum hidden inside the walls. Around him, the white pillars shimmered in the early heat, tall and indifferent, like silent gods. He had carved every beam, shaped every joint, obeyed every order. For years he'd built dreams that weren't his, dreams that rested on his back, his blood, his silence. But today, something had shifted. There was a tremor in his chest that wasn't fear anymore. It was memory, maybe, or defiance. A song hummed at the edge of his mind, one his mother used to whisper in the dark when the chains felt heavier than breath. He could still hear her voice when the wind moved through the rafters, like the house itself was singing her name. And then came the sound, a crack like thunder. The roof groaned, shuddered, and in that split second before the world fell apart, Moses closed his eyes. He wasn't praying. He was remembering. Before we go deeper into this story, into the truth Charleston buried beneath its marble and magnolia, make sure you stay until the end. Because what Moses did next didn't just bring down a mansion. It brought down everything that mansion stood for. The smell of pine and sweat filled the morning air, thick and metallic like something alive. Moses worked before the sun rose, long before the city's bells began their proud chiming. His hands were already rough from years of carving other men's dreams into wood, but his movements were graceful, almost sacred. Each stroke of the plane against the beam was deliberate, reverent. The rhythm steadied him, one breath, one scrape, one heartbeat. It was the only rhythm in his life that he controlled. Charleston was still half asleep then, its streets damp from the night, the fog lying low like a secret that refused to lift. The grand houses along Meeting Street stood quiet, shrouded in early light, each one a monument to someone else's suffering. But this mansion, the one rising under his hands, was different, bigger, hungrier. The master, Jonathan Wainwright, wanted it to be the finest in the Carolinas. A roofline that would make the governor's house look like a barn. Moses heard him boast about it once, his voice heavy with brandy and pride. "It will be heaven itself," he said, laughing. "And I'll have built it with the best hands in the South." The best hands. The words echoed sometimes, late at night when Moses couldn't sleep, when the sound of hammering wouldn't leave his ears. His mother used to say his hands were a blessing. "They make beauty where there should be pain," she'd whisper. But she was gone now, sold when he was 14. The only thing he had left of her was the lullaby she sang, the one he hummed to himself when the nights grew too long. That morning, he felt the world watching him. The overseer sat nearby chewing tobacco, pretending not to care. But his eyes never left Moses's back. Beyond the yard, the marsh birds called, long and mournful, like they were warning him of something he already knew. He pressed harder into the wood, feeling it yield beneath the blade. Each piece of timber carried a part of him, his anger, his exhaustion, his quiet rebellion. The mansion was nearly half built, its frame rising like a skeleton against the light. The other enslaved men worked in silence, their eyes lowered, their bodies mechanical. They didn't speak unless spoken to, but their silence was heavy with thought, the kind of thought that can't be said out loud. Moses moved among them like a current, calm but unrelenting. They respected him, not because he ordered them, but because he didn't have to. Wainwright arrived around noon, as he always did, stepping out of his carriage with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His suit was spotless despite the heat. He clapped his hands, surveying the work. "Magnificent," he said, and turned toward Moses. "You'll be remembered for this, boy. I might even let your name be carved somewhere discreet." His laughter was soft and poisonous. Moses kept his gaze fixed on the wood. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. He didn't add the rest, that a name carved in stone meant nothing when the man it belonged to couldn't speak it freely. By evening, the light turned gold, spilling through the half-finished rafters like spilled honey. The other men trudged back to the quarters, but Moses stayed. He liked the solitude, the way the air changed when the tools went quiet. The house seemed to breathe differently then. He ran his hand along the beam above him, feeling its weight. He knew wood like other men knew words. He could read its mood, where it wanted to split, where it would hold. Sometimes he imagined the mansion could feel him too, that it knew who truly gave it life. As the last of the sun sank below the harbor, Moses sat on the edge of the frame and watched the city's lights flicker on. The church bells tolled in the distance, each note trembling through the air. He thought of heaven, not the one the preachers spoke about, but the one he built piece by piece, only to never live in it. He didn't know it yet. But that night was the first time the idea crossed his mind, that the same hands that built heaven could bring it down. Somewhere deep in the bones of the house, a plank creaked. The sound lingered in the air like a whisper, like a promise waiting to be kept. By the time summer reached its peak, the air in Charleston felt like a punishment. Even the sea breeze came heavy, tasting of salt and ash. The mansion had grown into a forest of beams and shadow, ribs of a beast waiting to be skinned. Moses could feel its hunger. Each morning when he laid his hands on the wood, it was as if the house demanded something more from him, his sweat, his silence, his years. Jonathan Wainwright arrived earlier, now restless, pacing the site like a man watching his own reflection. He was tall, handsome in the way wealth can make a man seem kind, though his kindness was only a costume stitched over fear. He feared time, failure, the loss of control. And Moses, though he didn't yet realize it, was becoming part of that fear. One afternoon, when the air shimmered and the other men had stepped away to rest in the shade, Wainwright called him over. "Moses," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow, "you've done more for this house than any man I've ever paid." He smiled as though it were generosity. "And I believe in rewarding a man's excellence." Moses stood still, his hat in his hands, eyes lowered but sharp. Wainwright walked closer, lowering his voice. "When this roof is done, when it's perfect, I'll see you free." The words fell softly, too soft. They slid into Moses's heart like a blade wrapped in silk. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Freedom. He'd heard the word before, like a story people whispered in secret, like a hymn too dangerous to sing. He thought of his mother, her hands, her voice, and how she'd looked at the horizon when she spoke of the north, as if she could already see it. "Sir," he said finally, the word dry in his throat. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Wainwright replied easily, smiling the way men do when they've already decided something else. "A man like you deserves it. But I'll need your best work. The roof must hold forever. This house, it will be my legacy. And maybe yours, too." He clapped Moses on the shoulder, then turned away, already calling for his carriage. Moses watched him go, the sound of the wheels fading into the heat. Freedom. The word echoed through his skull until it almost sounded like a lie. That night, in the quarters, he told no one. Not even Caleb, the older carpenter who had become like a brother to him. Some promises he knew could die if spoken aloud. Instead, he sat by the window, carving a small piece of cedar into the shape of a bird. It was a habit he'd picked up as a boy, carving freedom into wood when he couldn't find it anywhere else. Outside, the swamp cicadas sang their endless song, the night thick with heat and murmurs. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thunder rolled. In the following weeks, the promise drove him harder. He worked until his knuckles bled, until his back ached so deep it felt like the pain had roots. He repaired what others missed, strengthened what they hurried through. The overseer noticed but said nothing. Wainwright watched with quiet pride, unaware that the fire in Moses's chest had changed shape. Then one evening, as the sky bruised purple, Caleb pulled him aside. "You believe that man?" he asked, his eyes tired, voice low. Moses hesitated. "He said when the roof is done, Caleb cut him off. You've been here too long to think they keep their word." You build him heaven, and he'll build you a grave. Moses looked away, jaw tight. Then I'll make sure heaven remembers me. The days grew longer, the house taller. Wainwright's guests began to visit, their laughter sharp and brittle, echoing through unfinished halls. They admired the craftsmanship, the precision of the joints, the beauty of the wood, never the hands that shaped it. One woman, pale and jeweled, asked Wainwright who had built such exquisite work. He smiled, gesturing toward Moses from a distance. A fine servant, he said, gifted with his hands. Moses heard the word servant and felt something twist inside him. A quiet fury, old as the soil he stood on. That night, he stood beneath the half-finished roof and stared up at the sky through the gaps in the beams. The stars looked like holes torn in a veil. He imagined his mother's voice drifting through them, soft and steady. You are not what they name you. Below, the mansion creaked, a sound deep and mournful. And for the first time, he noticed something new, a flaw in the design, hidden where two beams met. A weak point, small, invisible, but dangerous. He traced it with his fingers, his pulse steady. Then, quietly, almost tenderly, he left it as it was. The mornings bled together after that, long stretches of work and heat, the same rhythm of hammer and breath. But something inside Moses had begun to shift, like a fault line widening beneath still ground. He no longer looked at the mansion as a place he was building for someone else. It had become a mirror, reflecting back everything the world refused to see. His patience, his anger, his hidden defiance. Each beam he lifted seemed to carry the ghost of a promise, whispering soon, soon, as though the house itself were conspiring to remind him. The sound of saws filled the air like steady thunder. The scent of sap and sweat clung to his clothes. He could feel the grain of the wood beneath his calloused palms, soft in some places, stubborn in others, like the temper of a living thing. Every now and then, he'd run his fingers across a joint or brace and think, if I pushed here, just a little wrong. But then he'd force the thought away. Not yet. Not while eyes still watched. Wainwright had begun bringing visitors more often, parading them through the construction like a trophy. Look at the scale, he'd say. Every inch of it crafted by hand. The roof alone will outlast me. He'd say it with pride, unaware of the irony bleeding from his words. Moses would stand in the background, eyes down, body still, his silence the same kind of obedience that once kept him alive. But at night, that silence turned to noise. He'd lie awake in his cot, hearing the walls of the mansion breathe through the dark. The timber swelled and groaned with the humidity, each sound distinct, the moan of a beam, the sigh of a joist. He knew every creak by heart, every shift in the bones of the place. It was a language, and he could almost understand what it was saying. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Caleb had started to mutter strange things while they worked. The house knows, brother, he'd say. It knows what we've done. It remembers. Moses would nod, though he didn't know whether he agreed or just didn't want to argue. The others avoided looking at the highest point of the frame, where the roof would soon meet heaven. They said it was cursed to stare at the top too long, that the eyes of God might catch you and wonder why you're standing where only angels should be. Then one afternoon, as they hoisted a beam into place, the rope slipped. The wood swung violently, catching a young worker named Samuel across the shoulder and sending him to the ground. The sound of his scream split the air. The overseer rushed in, shouting, cursing. The men froze. Only Moses moved, kneeling beside the boy, pressing a cloth to the wound. The bone had snapped beneath the skin, the flesh swollen and dark. Wainwright appeared minutes later, his face twisted in annoyance more than concern. Get him out of here, he ordered. We can't have blood on the timber. Moses stared at him. He needs a doctor. Wainwright blinked, surprised by the tone. Calm, steady, dangerous. He's property, he said flatly. If he lives, he works. If not, the loss is mine. Get back to your station. Moses stood slowly, the air around him thick with something that felt like thunder. For a moment their eyes met, the master and the man he'd mistaken for a tool. Then Moses turned away. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, the quarters were quiet. Samuel's bed was empty. No one asked where he'd gone. No one needed to. Moses sat outside, the sky dark and heavy, the trees whispering above. He felt the world tilting, just slightly, but enough to make balance seem fragile. He thought of Wainwright's promise, of the roof that must hold forever. And suddenly, he wondered what forever looked like when built on lies. He rose before dawn the next morning, returning to the site before anyone else. The mansion stood in silhouette, black against a red horizon. The wood still smelled faintly of blood. He ran his hand along the edge of the beam that had fallen, solid, strong, perfect, and yet, the next one he cut, he shaved just a little too thin. Imperceptible. Intentional. It wasn't sabotage, not yet. It was something quieter. A conversation between him and the house. As the sun climbed, light filtered through the open frame, painting the floor in gold and dust. He closed his eyes and listened to the creaks again, each one a pulse beneath his fingers. It felt like the mansion was breathing in time with him. That night, when the others returned to their bunks, Moses stayed behind again. He climbed onto the scaffolding and sat beneath the unfinished roof, staring out over the city. Charleston lay below him, glowing, deceitful, beautiful. The harbor shimmered like glass, and in that stillness, a single drop of rain fell through the open beams and struck the wood beside him. Then another. Then another. He looked up, letting the rain touch his face. It smelled of iron and salt, the kind of storm that never comes quietly. The house groaned again, long, low, and deep. And Moses whispered to it, barely moving his lips, "I hear you." The storm arrived before dawn, rolling in from the coast like a warning too long ignored. Thunder rattled the scaffolding, and rain slashed through the gaps in the half-built roof. The mansion loomed against the sky, not a home yet, but a thing alive, restless, shivering beneath the weight of its own ambition. Moses stood beneath its frame, drenched to the bone, hammer still in hand. He didn't move until the wind tore the breath from his chest. The storm's voice filled the silence inside him, and for a moment, it felt like freedom. By morning, the yard was a swamp of mud and sawdust. The other men trudged through it without complaint, repairing what the night had undone. Wainwright arrived late, his carriage wheels sinking in the muck, his temper as brittle as the sky. "If this roof isn't sealed before the season turns," he barked, "I'll have you all replaced." His voice carried through the yard, slicing through the sound of hammers. He turned to Moses. "You, especially. You wanted freedom, didn't you?" "Then earn it." The words hit like stones, and yet Moses said nothing. He only nodded once, then turned back to the frame. Caleb watched him with tired eyes. "He's tightening the rope around your neck, brother," he muttered. "Don't let him," Moses didn't answer. There were too many voices inside his head already. His mother's song, the creaking of the beams, the whisper of the house remembering every cut, every nail, every lie. The wood had begun to speak to him in patterns. Sometimes in the wind, sometimes in the stillness. It wasn't madness. It was memory. 2 days later, a letter arrived, sealed in red wax and carried by a young boy whose shoes were too clean for the mud. Wainwright read it beneath the shade of the porch, his face pale in the light. He folded it twice, then a third time, his fingers trembling. "Business in Charleston," he murmured, though no one had asked. "Family matters." His eyes flicked toward Moses for half a heartbeat, then away again. That night, Wainwright didn't go home. He stayed inside the unfinished house, pacing the upper floor by candlelight. Moses saw the flicker through the cracks and watched from below, unseen. The master's voice drifted down, not the loud arrogance he wore in daylight, but something quieter. Fear, maybe? He was speaking to himself or to someone only he could see. The words were indistinct, but one phrase caught in the wind and carried to Moses's ear. "They'll take everything." When the candle finally died, Moses stayed there, listening to the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that stretched deep into the bones of the place. He felt something shift again, not in the structure, but in the story he'd been told. The next day, the overseer mentioned almost casually that Wainwright's debts were as tall as that roof. The man laughed when he said it, but there was an edge to it. Moses didn't laugh. It made the promise sound smaller now, fragile, as if it could splinter at any touch. By evening, the rain returned. Moses stayed after the others had gone, patching a seam along the rafters. He worked slowly, methodically. When he leaned down to retrieve a tool, something caught his eye. A small parchment, folded and wedged between two beams, damp but legible. He pulled it free and opened it under the faint light. It was a copy of a contract. His name was there. Moses, Carpenter, Negro property, written in cold, perfect ink. The words beneath it were worse. Property of Jonathan Wainwright. Transfer deferred pending full completion of mansion structure. And at the bottom a date, not the promise of freedom. The promise of sale. His throat tightened. For a moment, the world tilted. He heard the storm again, distant but familiar, roaring through his ears. He folded the paper and pressed it to his chest, feeling the damp bleed through his shirt. His breath came slow, steady. He thought of the promise, of heaven, of legacy, of freedom after the roof was done. He thought of how easily men build lies into foundations, how easily they forget that wood remembers pressure, that every joint holds history. He didn't tell anyone about the letter. He didn't need to. It changed him. From that night on, his silence wasn't submission anymore. It was strategy. Every strike of his hammer became deliberate. Every plank a choice. The house rose higher, more beautiful, more fragile. Wainwright returned to his boasting, unaware that every perfect piece of timber held a secret now, a flaw hidden beneath precision, a truth buried in grain. Sometimes, late at night, Moses would stand beneath the unfinished roof and whisper the same question to the dark. What happens when heaven falls? And the mansion would answer him softly, in the groan of the wood. You already know. Charleston's heat thickened as the weeks stretched on, the kind of heavy, suffocating air that made men mean and restless. The mansion had begun to look complete from the outside, a grand facade of white pillars and perfect symmetry, so flawless that no one dared to look closer. But inside, the air was different. Still, expectant. It carried the faint scent of sawdust and something else, something faintly metallic, like tension waiting to spark. Moses worked with a new kind of calm, a stillness that made the others uneasy. He didn't rush, didn't speak unless spoken to. His eyes, once patient, had turned sharp and deliberate, studying every joint, every line of the roof above him. Caleb noticed it first. "You've got something burning behind your eyes, brother," he said one afternoon, wiping his brow. "You building or breaking?" Moses didn't answer. He just smiled, faintly, like a man who'd already made peace with both. The promise, that poisoned sentence Wainwright had given him, had turned from hope into something colder. It pulsed in his chest with every strike of the hammer. He had found ways, small and invisible, to leave traces within the wood. A mismeasured joint by a fraction of an inch. A misplaced wedge hidden beneath plaster. To anyone else, it was perfection. To Moses, it was prophecy. The mansion's beauty grew in proportion to its fragility. And Wainwright, drunk on his own triumph, couldn't see the danger glinting right beneath his feet. He'd walk the halls and run his hands across the polished banisters, speaking of parties and governors, of music and candlelight. "We'll open the roof for the ball," he said once, with the confidence of a man who thought the world was his inheritance. Under the stars. It will be unforgettable, unforgettable. The word lingered in Moses's mind long after the master was gone. At night, he'd stay in the shadows beneath the floorboards, running his hands along the underside of the beams, feeling where pressure gathered. The wood was alive under his touch, groaning, whispering, remembering. Sometimes he'd light a small lantern and sit there for hours, watching the flicker of flame dance across the grains. Fire had a strange beauty. It destroyed with grace. In the quarters, whispers had started. Men who once avoided him now watched him differently, not with fear, but with recognition. Something about him felt inevitable, like a storm they'd known was coming. One night, Caleb followed him outside. "You're planning something," he said, his voice low, as if the trees could overhear. Moses didn't deny it. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that some houses ain't meant to stand?" Caleb looked at him for a long time. "You bring it down. You bring yourself down with it." Moses nodded. Maybe that's the only way to be free. The wind carried the sound of the city that night. Laughter, bells, the clatter of carriages. Somewhere a woman was singing, her voice floating through the dark. Moses closed his eyes and thought of his mother again, of her lullaby about rivers that ran north, of voices that couldn't be buried no matter how deep the ground. The next day, he worked higher than ever before, up near the roofline, where the air thinned and the view of Charleston spread wide beneath him. From there, the city looked peaceful, small, gilded, asleep. But he could see what others couldn't, the cracks in its perfection. The cruelty that built it, the silence that kept it standing. When the sun began to set, he stayed behind again, the others long gone. He climbed up the frame and stood beneath the unfinished roof, his hand brushing the support beam that would soon hold the grand chandelier. He pressed his palm against it and felt the tremor deep inside the wood. "Hold fast," he whispered, "until the right moment." Below, in the distance, he saw Wainwright's lantern flicker as the master walked the property line. His voice carried faintly through the dark, talking to himself about debts, guests, and redemption. He spoke like a man building eternity out of lies. Moses climbed down slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He walked to the edge of the site, where a pile of scrap wood and coal sat forgotten. He picked up a small splinter of cedar, the same kind he used to carve birds as a boy. He turned it over in his hand, then broke it in half. The sound was sharp, final. That night he dreamed of rain again. Only this time the roof wasn't unfinished. It was whole and falling. He saw the chandeliers crash, the marble shatter, the light disappear into the dust. And through it all, he heard a voice, soft, familiar, steady. "You built their heaven, child. Now set it free." When he woke, dawn was still hours away. He sat up, breath heavy, and realized the dream wasn't a warning. It was a map. He rose, walked barefoot to the window, and watched lightning flicker across the horizon. Charleston slept unaware. The mansion waited in silence, somewhere deep inside its walls. The fire had already started, small, invisible, burning quietly beneath the floorboards of his resolve. By the time the mansion stood complete, Charleston called it Wainwright's heaven. People rode out from the city just to see it, white marble columns that shimmered in the heat, windows polished until they caught the sun like mirrors, and a ballroom so wide it swallowed sound. Every board, every nail, every stroke of paint had come through the hands of those who would never set foot inside once the doors were opened. The irony was so vast it almost became holy. Moses stood at a distance that morning, among the laborers who were no longer needed. The final inspection had been done. Wainwright had ordered new coats for his servants, imported wines from France, and musicians from Savannah. "A night for angels," he said, beaming. "A night the city will never forget." The words slipped through Moses like the whisper of a blade. He could feel the pulse of the house even from here. He had built it to breathe, to ache, to wait. Every beam carried a whisper of disobedience. Every joint a seed of collapse. The house didn't just stand, it listened. Caleb approached quietly, a bundle slung over his shoulder. "Tonight's the night, then," he said. It wasn't a question. His eyes were tired, but his voice held the tremor of belief. "You sure?" Moses didn't answer at first. He watched the mansion glimmer under the noon light, as if heaven itself had decided to rest there for a moment. Then, softly, he said, "If we don't make it fall, they'll build 1,000 more just like it." The city swelled with noise that evening. Carriages rolled over cobblestones, their wheels spitting sparks. Lanterns glowed along the fences. Women in silk gowns glided through the doors, laughter trailing like perfume. The men were louder, red-faced with pride and bourbon. The air buzzed with heat and vanity. Moses waited in the shadows, just beyond the tree line. He'd memorized every sound of the mansion, the groan of its rafters, the hollow under the staircase, the way the wind pressed against its bones. It wasn't destruction he heard in his mind. It was release. The house wanted to breathe one last time. Caleb met him by the storage shed. "It's all here," he said, lifting a small crate. "Pitch, rags, the makings of fire. After tonight, there'll be no going back." Moses knelt and struck a match, not to light it, but to watch the flare, the way it consumed the dark around it. "There's never been a going back," he murmured. Inside the mansion, the violins began to play. Through the open windows came a waltz so slow and serene it almost hurt. Moses could see the chandelier now, gleaming with dozens of candles, trembling ever so slightly. Beneath it stood Wainwright, laughing, raising a glass. His voice carried above the music, to prosperity. "To the house that will outlast us all." The match went out in Moses's hand. He picked up the torch. They moved like ghosts, silent, sure, shadows bending through the garden paths. The servants at the back door didn't look up. They had learned long ago that seeing too much could cost them everything. Moses slipped inside the service hall, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. The air inside the mansion was different, suffocatingly sweet, thick with the scent of lilies and wax. He moved through the rooms he had built, touching the walls as he passed. His fingers lingered on the grain of the banister, the curve of the archway, the smooth coolness of the marble he'd once polished until his hands bled. He whispered under his breath, not a prayer, but a farewell. Upstairs, laughter swelled. The chandelier swayed just enough to catch the light wrong, casting long, flickering shadows down the staircase. Caleb handed him the torch. The flame flickered nervously, as though it knew what it was about to do. Moses hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. "You think they'll ever know our names?" Caleb asked softly. "No," Moses said, "but they'll remember the night heaven burned." He touched the torch to the draped linen that lined the servants' corridor. The fabric caught fast, first a shimmer, then a hiss, then a bloom of orange. Fire spoke in its own language, one he understood better than any sermon. It climbed, eager, hungry, devouring its confinement. The music upstairs went on. The violins sang louder, masking the crackle below. The first shout came minutes later, muffled, confused. By the time the waltz stumbled and fell silent, the smoke had already begun to pour from the vents. Moses stood at the center of the lower hall, watching the fire crawl along the beams he had carved. The wood popped and sighed, like it had been waiting years for this. Caleb grabbed his arm. "It's time!" But Moses didn't move. His eyes were fixed upward, where the chandelier trembled above the dancers. It swung once, twice, then the ceiling gave a low, hollow groan. Screams erupted. Glass shattered. And in that moment, as the chandelier tore free and came crashing down, the sound wasn't chaos. It was music, perfect and inevitable. He turned then, running through the back hall as the flames roared into life. The air was thick, searing. Behind him, heaven collapsed beam by beam, swallowing the laughter, the wealth, the arrogance. Outside, the sky turned red. People ran from the mansion, gowns aflame, faces streaked with soot and disbelief. The city's bells began to ring, shrill and desperate, but too late. Moses and Caleb stood at the edge of the marsh, watching the inferno consume everything. The reflection in the water looked like the world ending, and maybe it was. Caleb spoke first. "You did it," Moses didn't answer. His face was lit by the glow, expression unreadable. He watched until the roof caved in, until the last of the pillars fell, until the sky itself seemed to bow. Then quietly he said, "No, it did what it was always meant to." He turned and began to walk toward the darkness, leaving the burning mansion behind. The heat licked his back, but he didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't need to. He could feel the house's final breath echoing in his chest, the sound of heaven falling and something human rising in its place, and above the roar of fire, carried faintly through the wind, he thought he heard her again, his mother's voice, soft and steady, singing him home. When morning came, the sky hung low and colorless. Charleston woke beneath a haze of smoke and disbelief. The mansion was gone, nothing but a skeletal outline of chimneys and blistered stone. The air smelled of iron and salt, the earth still warm beneath the ashes. For a moment, it seemed like the city itself had forgotten how to speak. People gathered at the edges of the ruin, whispering, clutching handkerchiefs to their mouths. Some wept, though not for the lives lost, but for the grandeur burned away. The fire had eaten more than timber. It had devoured pride. The gossip spread fast, carried on trembling voices. A tragedy, they said. An act of God. And yet behind closed doors, others muttered darker things. Names, rumors, curses. Moses was already miles away by then. He and Caleb had taken to the river before dawn, their small boat slipping through the fog like a thought no one dared say aloud. The current was slow, heavy with silt, and the oars creaked softly in the stillness. Neither man spoke for a long time. It wasn't freedom they felt. It was something quieter, heavier, like the pause after a storm when the world hasn't yet decided what to become. Caleb finally broke the silence. "You think they'll come after us?" Moses stared ahead, the mist swallowing the banks. "They'll come after someone. They always do." He could still feel the warmth of the fire in his skin, smell the faint trace of smoke that clung to his hair. But beneath that, beneath everything, was a strange hollowness. He had thought the fall of the mansion would fill something inside him, that he'd feel victory or vengeance or even peace. Instead, there was only quiet. The boat drifted past a cluster of cypress trees, their roots twisting out of the water like reaching hands. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, a slow, mournful sound. It carried over the water, hollow and endless. Caleb shifted, his voice rough. "I keep seeing their faces, the ones inside." Moses closed his eyes. "So do I." He had built that house with precision, but destruction was never precise. It didn't choose. It didn't care. He had told himself that justice required fire, but justice had no mercy, and mercy had no fire. When they reached the far side of the marsh, they hid the boat in the reeds. Caleb wanted to keep moving, deeper inland where no one would recognize them. But Moses stopped him. "Go on," he said. "You can still make it north if you follow the river." "There's a trader who helps folks cross," Caleb frowned. "What about you?" Moses looked back toward the horizon where faint smoke still rose like a ghost. "I've got something left to finish." He didn't say what it was, and Caleb didn't ask. There were things that words couldn't carry. Caleb clasped his shoulder, rough palms against rough skin, then turned and vanished into the trees. Moses walked alone. The path wound through pine and moss, the air thick with the hum of insects and the distant sound of running water. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground remembered what he had done. He passed a small graveyard, half swallowed by weeds, unmarked stones, no names. He paused, letting his fingers trace the edge of one. For a moment, he thought of his mother again. He remembered the way she used to hum in the fields, quiet songs with no words. She'd told him once that every stone in Charleston had a story, that even the ones laid by slaves carried whispers of freedom if you listened close enough. He listened now, but all he heard was wind. By the second night, he reached the outskirts of the city. Patrols moved through the streets, searching, shouting questions no one dared answer. The Wainwright estate was sealed off, soldiers, ropes, the smell of wet ash. From behind a row of warehouses, Moses watched as men picked through the wreckage, their boots crunching through the charred remains. Someone had found the chandelier, or what was left of it, a twisted heap of blackened iron. Wainwright himself was gone, they said. Trapped inside, his body burned beyond recognition. Others had survived, scarred and blinded, whispering about a shadow in the flames. Moses turned away. He didn't stay to hear the rest. As night fell, he wandered to the edge of the harbor. The tide was low, the wooden docks glistening under the moonlight. Ships creaked against their ropes, their sails folded like weary wings. He sat at the water's edge, staring at his reflection, blurred, fractured by the ripples. "What did you do?" he whispered to himself. The words had no anger, no pride, just wonder. The fire had ended something, but it hadn't freed him. It had only revealed how deep the chains went, not the ones forged from iron, but the ones built from memory, guilt, and silence. He thought of the mansion again, the way it had glowed before it fell, the sound of the ceiling groaning like a dying giant. It had been more than a building. It had been a confession carved in wood and stone, and he, its maker, had destroyed his own creation to reclaim something he couldn't name. Behind him, a soft voice broke the stillness. "They're saying it was the Lord's hand." Moses turned. An old woman stood by the crates, her face hidden by a shawl. "The Lord don't build houses like that," he said quietly. She studied him for a long moment. "No," she said, "but he burns them." Moses looked back at the water. The reflection of the moon trembled on the surface, rippling like breath. The woman stepped closer. "You can't outrun what's already burned," she said, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the night. He sat there long after she was gone, listening to the tide pull at the shore, steady and patient. Somewhere behind him, Charleston began to stir again, the sound of hammering, rebuilding, pretending nothing had changed. But something had, in the ruins of a mansion, in the ashes of pride, in the silence that followed. Something had shifted that could never be rebuilt, and Moses, watching the slow dance of the water against the docks, finally whispered to no one. Maybe that's enough, but the wind didn't answer. It only carried the faint echo of fire, a sound that would follow him wherever he went. Weeks passed, though time in Charleston no longer moved the way it once did. The city walked on glass now, careful, cautious, pretending that the air didn't still smell faintly of smoke. The newspapers called it the Great Wainwright Fire, their words polished and hollow. No mention of the enslaved men who'd built the mansion. No names beyond those lost in privilege. They printed sketches of what the house had looked like, as though its beauty were the only casualty. Moses had no name in those stories. He was a whisper, a rumor told in backrooms and taverns. Some said they'd seen him running into the woods that night, his face lit by the flames like a prophet's. Others said he'd drowned in the marsh, the river claiming him for what he'd done. No one knew for sure, but Moses was still there, hiding in plain sight. He had taken work at the docks under another name, unloading crates from ships, blending into the rhythm of sweat and salt. His hands never stopped moving, as if still trying to build something, even if only out of habit. He slept in an abandoned warehouse near the water, the walls still damp with salt. The nights were restless. In his dreams, he heard the mansion creak and fall again, over and over, but it wasn't the fire that haunted him. It was the silence that followed, the sound of the beams settling, like a body finally giving up breath. One evening, a storm rolled in from the coast. The wind howled through the harbor, waves slapping the pilings. As the sky split with thunder, Moses stood outside, letting the rain soak through his shirt, wash the soot from his skin. He lifted his face to the downpour as if it might cleanse more than dirt, as if it might unmake him. A figure approached through the rain, moving with purpose. At first, Moses thought it was Caleb, but as the man drew closer, he saw the uniform, the brass buttons, the polished boots. A constable. "Evening," the man said, raising his lantern. The light caught Moses's face, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath. "You work down here?" the constable asked, voice casual, though his eyes were sharp. Moses nodded slowly. "Unloading ships mostly. Name?" "Samuel," he lied. The word came easy now. The constable studied him for a moment longer, then nodded toward the sea. "Bad weather comin'. Be smart to stay off the water tonight." Moses said nothing. The constable lingered a heartbeat too long, then turned and walked away, his lantern bobbing through the mist. Moses watched until the light disappeared, then exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He went back inside the warehouse, lit a small candle, and sat against the wall. The flicker threw long shadows across the floor, stretching and twisting. He watched them dance and thought about how fire and shadow were born from the same light. That night, as the storm raged outside, he dreamed again. But this time the mansion wasn't burning. It was whole. He walked through its halls, quiet and empty. The floorboards whispered beneath his feet. In the grand parlor, he found Wainwright standing by the window, his suit immaculate, his face untouched by flame. "You built this," Wainwright said, turning toward him. "And you destroyed it." Moses wanted to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. "Do you think the world will remember your hands?" Wainwright asked. "They'll rebuild, Moses, they always do. The only thing fire teaches is how to build again." Then the walls began to bleed light, white, searing, endless. Moses reached out, but the world dissolved around him. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the candle long since dead. The next morning, the docks buzzed with talk. A trader from Savannah had been arrested upriver, accused of helping escaped slaves. They said he'd given names under threat of the whip. By noon, Moses knew Caleb's name would be among them. He didn't wait for confirmation. He packed what little he had, bread, a tin flask, a carving knife, and slipped into the maze of alleys behind the waterfront. Every street felt sharper, every shadow watching. He'd built houses that defied storms, but this was something else. Survival had no blueprint. He found an old friend of his mother's, a washerwoman named Ruth, living above a tavern near the market. She opened the door, her eyes widening as she saw him. "Moses," she whispered. "Lord above, I thought you gone." He shook his head. "Not yet," she let him in, bolting the door behind him. "They're looking for men like you," she said quietly. "They say someone's talking. They want a name to hang it on." Moses stared out the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky still carried the weight of the storm. "Then let them hang it," he said. Ruth stepped closer. "You can't let 'em catch you. Not after all that." "I didn't do it for them to see," he said softly. "I did it so they couldn't forget." She studied him, her expression a mix of pity and fear. "They'll forget anyway," she said. "They always do." Moses looked down at his hands, scarred, blackened at the edges, still trembling faintly. "Then I'll remember for them." That night, he left Charleston for good. He walked until the city lights faded, until the road turned to mud and the trees swallowed the horizon. He didn't know where he was going. Maybe north, maybe nowhere. But with each step, he felt something shifting inside him. Not forgiveness, not peace, but a strange kind of surrender. By the time dawn broke, he was just a shadow moving through the fog. The world behind him burned to memory, and in that quiet gray between night and day, for the first time in his life, Moses smiled, small, weary, and almost free. He walked north until the air changed. The humid breath of the Carolina marshlands thinned, replaced by the clean, sharp chill of higher ground. The trees grew taller, quieter, the soil darker and softer beneath his boots. Sometimes he traveled with others, runaways, wanderers, men who spoke little and slept lightly. But mostly he was alone. Solitude suited him now. He had lived too long inside other men's houses, built too many walls to crave company. Every few miles he passed evidence of the world rebuilding itself. New plantations rising from old ash, men hammering, sawing, shaping wood into familiar sins. He would stand for a moment and watch, the rhythm of the hammers like a heartbeat he couldn't unhear. The fire in Charleston had burned only one house. The rest of the world kept building. At night, when the roads emptied, he made camp near streams or in abandoned barns. He still carried his mother's small wooden cross in his pocket, worn smooth from years of touch. Sometimes, when sleep wouldn't come, he'd rub the edges until splinters pricked his skin. It wasn't prayer exactly, more like memory, sharp enough to remind him he was still real. Weeks turned to months. Rumors traveled faster than men, and they carried the story of Charleston with them. A cursed house, a master swallowed by his own pride, and a whisper of a man whose hands had built both the glory and the ruin. No one spoke Moses's name, but he began to hear fragments of himself in other people's stories. A man with fire in his eyes, a ghost who built only to destroy. The legend was growing, even as he tried to disappear. One evening, he came upon a small settlement tucked between rolling hills and pine. Smoke curled from chimneys and the sound of laughter drifted from a wooden porch. It was not a plantation, just a gathering of freedmen, farmers, and wanderers carving a new life from the earth. For the first time in years, Moses didn't feel watched when he entered. No one asked who he was. No one cared where he'd come from. They just nodded, offered him food, a bed, a name he could use if he wanted one. He stayed. He built again. Not mansions this time, homes. Small, sturdy, honest. Houses with open windows and low roofs, where every sound could be heard and every face could be seen. He taught others what he knew, how to shape a beam so it would hold, how to read the grain of wood like scripture. He worked with the kind of gentleness that can only come from a man who has seen what cruelty does to the things we make. Years passed this way, though Moses never marked them. The scar on his hand faded, the fire's echo softened. He rarely spoke of Charleston, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind pushed through the trees just right, he'd catch a scent, smoke, lilac, rain, and it would all come back in flashes. The chandelier, the scream, the music cut short. There was one woman in the settlement who saw through him. Her name was Eliza. She was a widow with calm eyes and a voice that carried a kind of peace he didn't trust. She worked beside him often, planing wood, her laughter like the strike of a hammer, clear, decisive. One evening, she found him sitting by the edge of the clearing, staring at the distant hills. "You always look like you're waiting for something," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Maybe I am," she sat beside him. "What is it?" He hesitated. "A sign. That what I did meant something." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Maybe the meanin' ain't in the doin'. Maybe it's in what comes after." He wanted to believe her. But belief had become another kind of labor, and he was too tired to lift it. That night, he dreamed of fire again, but not the mansion. This time it was smaller, quieter. A hearth flame in a home he didn't yet have. In the dream, someone was singing. A child's voice, high and uncertain, weaving through the crackle of wood. When he woke, there was dew on the grass and light seeping into the cabin. He sat for a long while before standing, the dream still clinging to him. Then he went outside and began to work. He built a new house that day, not for anyone else but for himself. The walls were plain, the wood unpainted, the roof pitched low. But it was his, born not from command or profit, but from silence. When he was done, he sat inside, listening to the wind move through the open windows. It sounded almost like breath. Eliza came by in the evening, holding a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "You finally built one for yourself," she said, smiling. He nodded. "Didn't think I'd ever have it in me again." She set the bread down. "You had it all along. You just had to stop building for ghosts." For the first time since the fire, Moses laughed. It was quiet, hoarse, but real. As night fell, he lit a single candle and placed it in the center of the room. The flame flickered softly, painting the walls gold. He watched it, remembering another fire, larger, merciless, and thought about how both burned for the same reason, to reveal what had been hidden. Outside, the crickets sang. The world, somehow, kept moving. He didn't know if he'd ever be forgiven, or if forgiveness was even the point. All he knew was that the house stood solid, the air smelled clean, and his hands, those same hands that had built and destroyed, were finally still. And for that one moment, in the quiet hum of the night, Moses felt something he hadn't in years. Not redemption, not peace, just enough. The kind of enough that comes when a man realizes that even ruin can become a kind of creation. The years folded into one another, the way slow rivers merge into sea. Seasons bled from green to gold to gray, and the little settlement grew into a village. Moses's house stood at its edge, a quiet sentinel of timber and patience. The children there called him Mr. Mose, the man who could make wood sing. They'd gather near his workshop, listening to the soft rasp of his tools, the rhythm of his breath keeping time with the grain. He never told them the whole story. How could he? The truth was too heavy, too dangerous. But in his silences, in the way his eyes sometimes drifted to the horizon when smoke rose in the distance, they learned that he had lived other lives before this one, that he had known the sound of fire too well. Some nights he still woke before dawn, heart pounding, ears filled with the phantom roar of collapse. In those moments, he'd walk outside, barefoot in the dew, and stand under the wide Carolina sky. The stars above were distant and unblinking, the same cold eyes that had watched him all his life. Yet now, beneath them, he felt something new, a stillness that wasn't emptiness, but acceptance. Eliza was there still, her hair silver now, her laughter softened but never gone. They lived side by side, not as lovers perhaps, but as something older and quieter, two souls bound by the shared work of remembering and forgetting. When she fell ill one winter, Moses built her a new bed from pine, sanding it until it gleamed like water. "So she'll rest easy," he told the others, though his hands trembled the whole time. After she passed, the village gathered to bury her under a magnolia tree. The air was cold but sweet with blossoms. Moses stood apart, silent, the weight of all the things unsaid pressing against his ribs. When the earth closed over her, he whispered her name once and turned back toward his house, the wind carrying it away. That night, he lit 2 candles instead of 1. The flames leaned toward each other, flickering like they were speaking in secret. He sat beside them until dawn, watching the light fade into day. As he grew older, his hands began to betray him. The fingers that once shaped cathedrals from wood now trembled too much to hold a chisel. He spent more time sitting on his porch, watching others build, offering quiet instruction. "Listen to the wood," he'd tell them. "It'll tell you what it can carry." They listened. Because even though the world was changing, the war coming, men talking about freedom and vengeance and hope, there was something eternal in his voice. Something that came from having seen both the making and the unmaking of everything. One evening, a traveler arrived from Charleston, a young scholar, dressed too fine for the road, with ink-stained hands and eyes bright with curiosity. He had heard stories of a slave carpenter who had once built a house so grand it cursed its own master. He wanted to write it down, he said, to preserve it, to make sure the man's name wasn't lost. Moses listened quietly, the air between them heavy with ghosts. "And what would you write?" he asked. "The truth," the scholar said. Moses smiled faintly. "Truth's heavier than wood, son. It'll break the floor if you ain't careful." "Still," the young man pressed. "They called him Moses of Charleston, said he built heaven and burned it down." For a long time, Moses said nothing. Then he looked toward the window, where the evening light spilled across the wall. The same soft gold as a fire before it takes. "Maybe he did," he said. "Maybe that was the only way heaven could fall close enough for men to see it." The scholar waited for more, but Moses didn't speak again. When the man left the next morning, he took nothing with him except that single sentence. Days turned slower after that. Moses could feel his body folding inward, his breath shallower each dawn. He no longer feared sleep. Some mornings he even welcomed it. He'd built his life like a house, beam by beam, mistake by mistake, and now it was ready to rest. On his last day, the sky was clear, the air bright with spring. The children were playing by the fields when they noticed his door open, the candle on the table still burning low. He was sitting in his chair, head bowed slightly, eyes closed. His hands lay open on his knees, palms upward, as if he'd been holding something invisible that had finally lifted away. They buried him beside the magnolia tree, next to Eliza. The village sang low, unpolished hymns that carried more heart than harmony. When it was done, the wind rose gently, stirring the petals, scattering white blooms across the fresh earth. Years later, When people passed through the village and asked about the man who built half its homes, they would point to the little house at the edge of the hill. That was Moses's place, they'd say. The man who made wood breathe. Some claimed that on quiet nights, when the wind turned south, the old house whispered. Not with words, but with a kind of sigh, like wood shifting under invisible weight. They said it sounded almost like music, or like the slow collapse of a mansion that had finally made peace with its own ruin. And maybe, if you stood there long enough, you could almost hear his mother's voice in the distance, humming the same tune she once sang to her son in the fields. A song for hands that built, for fire that cleansed, and for the strange, fragile mercy that follows both. The house still stands. The walls creak, the beams breathe, and the air within it carries the scent of pine and thyme. Some say that if you press your ear against its boards, you'll hear a heartbeat. Maybe it's the echo of the man who built it. Maybe it's the sound of heaven, remembering how to fall.